All right. Well, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. It is a pleasure and privilege to welcome you virtually to Indiana University and the University of Tokyo for our joint virtual seminar on Japan-China relations. My name is Adam Liff, and I'm the director of the 21st Century Japan Politics and Society Initiative here at Indiana University's Hamilton Lugar School. I will be your host today, but I am extremely pleased to be able to moderate today's discussion with my longtime mentor and friend, Akio Takahara, from the University of Tokyo's Graduate School of Public Policy, which is co-sponsoring today's event. Akio, before we get started, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, thanks so much, Adam, and thank you, everybody, for joining this program today. You know, tomorrow is the 50th anniversary of the normalization of Japan-China relations, and what a timing that we are having this seminar. Yesterday, we had the state funeral of former Prime Minister Abe, and tomorrow is the big 50th day. And it's so important to discuss Japan-China relations, not only for the two countries, but for the regional context, and I believe the global context, especially in relation to U.S.-China relations, which of course is a focus of people's attention these days. So thank you so much, Adam, for taking this initiative, representing the GRASP, that is the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo. I'm so grateful to the Indiana University and your team over there. And a very warm welcome to everybody who's taking part in this seminar, especially those who are going to speak to us, but also we are looking forward to the discussions later on with the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Akio. I was thinking as you were talking, I in many ways began my career at the University of Tokyo studying Japan-China relations with you and your colleagues as a kenkyusei so many years ago. So this is kind of coming full circle in a way, and to do it the week of the 50th anniversary of normalization is just a really wonderful thing. So thank you for joining me. Thank you to the University of Tokyo for your support and co-sponsorship, and of course to everybody out there for joining us. So although the University of Tokyo, of course, needs no introduction, for those of you attending a 21 JPSI virtual seminar for the first time, our initiative probably does. To put it simply, 21 JPSI's mission at Indiana University is to support research, teaching, and programming on contemporary Japanese politics, social issues, and Japan's foreign relations, and to serve as a hub in the U.S. Midwest for the study of contemporary Japan and its domestic and foreign policy challenges. Now, it's hard to come up with a single phenomenon that presents a wider and more complicated array of foreign policy challenges for both the United States and Japan than the rise of China and everything that comes with it. And Thursday's 50th anniversary of the 1972 Japan-PRC normalization communique really presents a fantastic opportunity to not only to reflect on the past and present of this hugely important relationship between the world's second and third largest economies, but also to support 21 JPSI's other mandate to facilitate collaborations and partnerships between U.S. and Japan-based scholars. And I'm especially grateful to the Japan Foundation for providing the generous financial support that has made tonight's collaboration possible. Now, let me turn to today's agenda and game plan, which you can also see on the screen. In the interest of time, we will not offer lengthy introductions of each panelist, but you can find links to more information about each speaker on the event webpage. As you can see from the slide, we really have a tremendous lineup of experts on Japan-China relations from universities in both Japan and the United States today. But before I turn things over to our first speaker, just a couple quick logistical notes about how tonight's seminar will work. We will begin with each of our 6 panelists offering about 7 minutes of prepared remarks. The first 3 speakers will focus on the 20th century historical legacies of 1972, and the second 3 speakers will discuss contemporary issues affecting Japan-China relations today. The prepared remarks should take us to roughly the halfway mark of this 90-minute event. And at that point, Professor Takahara and I will engage the panelists in a brief discussion about the issues raised in their remarks. At that time, we will also open up the chat, so please submit questions to our panelists then. After the discussion, we'll use the remainder of our time for audience Q&A. Now, with apologies, we do have a sizable audience today, and I'm running tonight's event personally off my Zoom account. So for bandwidth and security reasons, I ask for your understanding when we disable the chat during the first half of the event, and ask that audience members kindly stay muted and off video throughout. Depending on your Zoom settings, you may wish to instruct Zoom to hide non-video participants. And you can also pin the panelists' screens so you can focus on the speakers. And of course, as we have a very large audience today, I apologize in advance if you submit a question later and we are not able to get to it before we end right at 9 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. So with that all said, let me now get out of the way and turn things over to our first speaker, Professor Robert Hoppins of the University of Texas, Rio Grande. He will be discussing the significance of the 1972 Normalization Communique and its implications for Japan's relations with China and Taiwan in the 1970s. But before I give him the floor, let me give a shameless plug of his wonderful book, which I have read once or twice already and am referencing in my own research these days. It's a wonderful book and I highly recommend it. We just posted a link to it in the chat. Rob, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Liff, for the kind introduction, for having me. In marking 50 years of Japan-China relations, as was mentioned in the introduction, we're really beginning our story with Prime Minister Tanaka Kakue's visit to Beijing and the normalization of relations between Japan and the People's Republic of China, the PRC, in September of 1972. Tanaka's trip, while perhaps not as familiar to an American audience as President Nixon's trip to Beijing in February of that year, was as important for post-war Japan-China relations as Nixon's visit was for U.S.-China relations. It might be important to point out right at the beginning that Tanaka's visit to Beijing went further in diplomatic and legal terms than did Nixon's visit. In September 1972, Japan and the PRC normalized relations. That is, they established full, normal diplomatic relations with the establishment of embassies and the exchange of ambassadors, something that the US and the PRC didn't do until 1979. The Japanese and the Chinese positions on various issues related to normalization were laid out in a joint communique issued on September 29th, 1972, at the end of Prime Minister Tanaka's visit. This joint communique was in many ways similar to the more famous, perhaps, U.S.-China Shanghai communique, but like that earlier document, it really became a foundational document for post-war Japan-China relations. In fact, Tanaka's visit and the joint communique were so important that many scholars talk about a 1972 system that really shaped Japan-China relations for several decades after 1972. Now, I won't be able to go into detail about the history of Tanaka's trip, but what I'll try to do is just bring up a few of the most important issues that were addressed in 1972, or in one particular case not addressed, that are still salient to Japan-China relations today, and which I think will probably come up and be elaborated upon in the following presentations. First, as in U.S.-China relations, so in Japan-China relations, Taiwan was the biggest issue. In the joint communique, the two sides basically laid out their respective positions on Taiwan. The PRC reiterated its position that Taiwan is an inalienable part of the PRC. The Japanese side stated that Japan, quote, fully understands and respects, unquote, this PRC position on Taiwan. Although it wasn't included explicitly in the joint communique, the PRC also insisted that the Japanese, upon normalization, cut official diplomatic relations with the Republic of China, the ROC, on Taiwan, which since 1952, the Japanese government had recognized as the legal government of China. On the other hand, it was also agreed that even after normalization, the Japanese would maintain unofficial economic, cultural, and interpersonal relations with Taiwan. And this pattern of cutting diplomatic relations with the Republic of China in order to normalize relations with the PRC, while still maintaining informal relations with Taiwan, would come to be referred to in some circles as the Japan model of normalization. And the PRC government would insist that the US follow this Japan model in normalizing relations at the end of the 1970s. What all of this means for a one China policy, I'll leave to later presentations to hash that out. But these basic positions on Taiwan were laid out in the 1972 joint communique. A second issue in 1972 was how to deal with the history of Japan's war in China, okay, an issue that famously bedevils Japan-China relations even today. The preamble to the joint communique included a Japanese statement of remorse or reflection on the damage that Japan caused to China during the war. The PRC, for its part, waived its claim to war reparations from Japan in the joint communique. On the other hand, a dispute over the legality of the 1952 treaty with the ROC and when exactly the war legally ended explains why the joint communique only rather cryptically refers to the end of the, quote, abnormal state of affairs, unquote, between Japan and China. A third important issue, one that was not addressed in the joint communique, was the territorial dispute over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. This issue was actually broached in the talks for hammering out the joint communique, but Zhou Enlai and the Chinese declined to discuss the issues, discuss this issue, okay? And the two sides still disagree over whether this means they had agreed to temporarily shelve this issue and bring it up in the future. In conclusion, I might just very briefly say a few words about relations for the rest of the 1970s. The normalization of relations in 1972 did not lead to an immediate or dramatic expansion in Japan's relations with the PRC for reasons related to the vagaries of PRC domestic politics and Japanese resistance to the PRC global anti-Soviet strategy. Relations with the PRC only really took off at the end of the 1970s with the start of the PRC's reform program and the beginning of Japanese economic aid or official development assistance, ODA, to China, which I think will come up in some of the later presentations. On the other hand, despite their unofficial nature, relations with Taiwan remained close throughout the 1970s as they do today. And despite disputes over things like the disposition of ROC property in Japan and the treatment of ROC symbols such as the Republic of China flag, in terms of economics, trade, tourism, relations with Taiwan outstripped those with the PRC for the rest of the decade. I think I'll stop here and I will leave elaboration on these issues to some of the following presentations. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Rob, for getting us started. Next up, we have my colleague at Indiana University, Professor Wendy Leutert, who will discuss the impact of increased exchanges between Japan and China in the 1970s and 1980s on China's political economy. Wendy, over to you.
Hi, everyone. So I'll be building on the previous set of remarks and tonight speaking on how China reimagined its reform era economy through engagement with Japan. In my remarks, I'll briefly talk about several of the mechanisms of increased engagement between Japan and China in the 1970s and 1980s, talk about some of its effects on China's economy and economic policies during this period, briefly discuss some of the obstacles and summarize some of the key takeaways about bilateral relations during this period. So I want to begin by talking about an important mechanism of bilateral engagement during this period in the form of advisors. It may not be well known that the very first formal advisors to China's State Council were two economic bureaucrats from Japan, Okita Saburo and then Sakisaka Masao. And they were serving in a formal capacity, advising China's government, primarily by sharing, of course, Japan's experience rather than telling China what they should do. But you can see here in the photo on the right, they're meeting with high-level leaders like Deng Xiaoping in Beijing, and both of them visited China multiple times in this capacity in 1979. Now, in addition to these formal advisors from Japan, there's a much larger number of individuals who are served in a more informal capacity, such as Kobayashi Minoru was one of those figures, and there were, of course, many others. And so in this figure, I'm showing you the foreign economic advisors to China's State Council during the early reform era. You'll see the two individuals from Japan were the very first ones who were invited. And China was particularly interested in learning from Japan's example about how to catch up rapidly economically after an extended period of domestic turmoil and destruction. In addition to the advisors in Japan, also China turned to economists from West Germany and later others from Singapore. Another important mechanism of bilateral engagement during this period was exchanges, which took a number of various forms, both formal and informal, in-person and direct. One important form was study tours that went in both directions, so from China to Japan, as well as from Japan to China. Another forum for these exchanges that was very active and important was government-facilitated associations. You'll see an image on the right as a picture of one of these such associations, a meeting that they were holding in 1985, the Sino-Japanese Economic Knowledge Exchange. And so there were a number of exchanges that were occurring in person and in both the different countries, as well as written correspondence, more informal and private between some of these individuals. To give you an example of what this looked like, here is one of the better known Chinese study tours to Japan in 1978, arriving in Japan only a few days after Deng Xiaoping had left. And this particular study tour led by China's National Economic Commission, they spent about a month in Japan, a 23-member delegation, and toured a number of different companies, published multiple reports upon their return back in China. They were very influential both internally within the government and also received a wide recognition in the public as well. And you see some images of this study tour to the right of the slide. The final mechanism I want to talk about today is examples. And here by examples, I mean the example of Japan's economy, its own experience, as well as examples of particular Japanese enterprises. And these were widely circulated in China in the form of writings on these topics by Chinese officials and scholars, as well as writings by Japanese scholars and officials that have been directly translated into Chinese. And to give you a sense of how numerous and important these works are, this is a figure I created based on data provided by China's Academy of Social Sciences, showing that throughout this decade-long period, there are a number of significant publications focused on Japan's economy and technology. Now, what effect did all of this have on China? Well, one important effect is the way that China itself combined economic planning and market reform drew from Japan's experience. Specifically, China's use of industrial policy to promote basic and export industries, as well as indirect guidance and state enterprise coordination to steer but not control economic activity. Japan also provided a justification and an important source for importing foreign technology that China used for its economic development and to modernize industry. Here I have a quotation from an advisor to China's State Planning Commission in 1981, stating, China and any developing country must vigorously develop foreign trade and introduce advanced technologies in order to speed up modernization and enter the ranks of the world's advanced economies as soon as possible. Japan's successful modernization in recent decades is a good example. A third effect on China's economic reform that has been widely studied is the influence of Japanese management practices, how they help to improve management and individual Chinese companies, as well as overall productivity. And the way this was done was by introducing clear metrics for accountability, integrated oversight throughout the production process. And this 1978 study tour that I spoke about a few minutes ago, one of their recommendations when they got back to China was that China establish an enterprise management association modeled on the Japan Productivity Center in Tokyo. And this association went on to do a number of trainings at the local level in China and had a significant effect. Now, of course, there are many obstacles that I'm not going to have time to discuss in detail, but just to speak in broad terms, that engagement did not always equal agreement or even understanding. So at these early exchanges, even though language was not an issue in some of these conversations because of excellent interpretation, the two sides were still having difficulty just understanding conceptually what the other side was talking about. And as a result of this, in 1982, the two sides collaborated and jointly published in China and Japan a economic encyclopedia to facilitate some of these conversations. But beyond the specific example, there are a number of broader language, cultural, economic, and political differences that also affected bilateral engagement. So just to briefly wrap up, Japan-China engagement during the 1970s and 80s occurred through multiple mechanisms. I've talked about only 3 of them tonight: advisors, exchanges, and examples. And what I really want to call attention to in these remarks is that bilateral movements of people and ideas, not only material assistance from Japan, was very transformative in shaping China's early economic reform and the subsequent trajectory of its economy. And I also want to call attention to the diverse actors below the national level, officials, scholars, and enterprise representatives who made important contributions to developing Japan-China relations during this period and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Folks, if you want to know more, Wendy's remarks were in part based on her recent publication called Reimagining the Chinese Economy Through Sino-Japanese Engagement in the 1980s. And we posted a link in the chat, and I encourage everyone to take a look. It's a fascinating project that she continues to work on. So thank you, Wendy. Next up, we have Professor Kawashima Shin from the University of Tokyo, who will discuss public opinion and history issues in the 1980s and 1990s. And most of our audience is probably already aware that Professors Kawashima and Takahara are 2 of the most respected Japanese experts on Japan-China relations. They are also co-authors of a seminal study of modern Japan-China relations, which is one of the very few academic books that I can honestly say I've read multiple times. Kawashima-sensei, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Am. Good morning, good evening. Yeah, it's just a great honor to be here to discuss this topic with you. Today, I talk on about the public opinion and the history issues in 1980s and 90s. At first, I share this chart, a very, very famous chart, as this chart is made by the Japanese Cabinet Office to show the trend of Japanese public opinion toward China. Green line shows the positive, more intimate feeling toward China, yellow line negative. Okay, so this chart started in 1978. So the positive feeling was, yes, to the about around 70% in 1980s in Japan toward China. However, at this point, in 1989, the positive rate was decreased to 51.6. And after that, until maybe the 2004 or 5, the positive and negative was similar or almost same. And after 2004 and 5, it changed drastically, and the negative increased to the 60, 70, and 80 or 90 now. Okay. Oh, this turning point, 1989, this meant Tiananmen Square incident, influence on Japanese public opinion, and 2004 and 5, the anti-Japanese movement in China. There are 2 big turning points. This is the basic, yes, background. This shares this chart. Okay. Second part, I talk about the prehistory before the normalization about the history problems in Japan and China. As you know, after the end of the war, in Japanese society, especially intellectual society, discuss about so-called responsibility of the war, emperor's responsibility towards war and aggression toward China. Yeah, and also the so-called the Sino-Japanese friendship movement was prevailed all over Japan. The activity has something, atonement consciousness toward China at the time. And also some soldiers visited China personally to make so-called reconciliation activities toward Chinese society, to build some stone monuments in China like Hangzhou. So there's some movement, and also about the Chiang Kai-shek. Okay, some Japanese conservative person praised Chiang Kai-shek in terms of his general policy on return of the soldiers and the waiver of the liberation, so-called 以德报怨 in Chinese. However, these movements were advanced basically in Japan, Japanese domestic society, because under the Cold War, it is difficult for them to make some activity with Chinese intellectuality or Chinese people. So most of Chinese do not know such activities. So regret. Anyway, and the third part, the normalization in 1972. Yes, as well as Taiwan issue, history issue itself was so important at the time. So both countries negotiated and get some consensus about history issue. we checked the articles in the Sino-Japanese joint statement in 1972. The Japanese side is keenly conscious of responsibility for the serious damage that Japan caused in the past to the Chinese people through the war, and deeply reproaches itself. Under both reparation, the government of PRC declared that in the interest of the friendship between the Chinese and the Japanese people, it denounces its demand for the war reparation from Japan. Under the Cultural Revolution, Chinese people, yes, some Chinese people could not accept such a normalization, but the Chinese government, yes, persuaded them, Chinese people, to make this joint statement and made normalization with Japan. After that, in 1980s, a series of so-called history problems happened, like textbook problem and the Yasukuni Shrine incident. Okay. However, in 1990s, Japan has had its advantages of the economy. Yeah, as when they said. So when the historical issue happened in 1980s, economic cooperation, including ODA, played a leverage role to recover the damage at the time. And also public opinion supports the Sino-Japanese relations positively, also supports its policy. In China, Deng Xiaoping, he stressed the importance of both economic development and history. He built the museum at the Marco Polo Bridge, and also he built the museum at the Nanjing Massacre. Not Jiang Zemin, Deng Xiaoping, he advanced it. That's so interesting. However, Tiananmen Square incident influenced on such a situation. Japanese public opinion was drastically changed by Tiananmen Square incident, as I said on the chart. After that, after the incident, in 1992 to 1995, Western countries kept their economic sanctions toward China. Japanese public opinion for China was getting worse, and the advantage Japanese economy to China was getting lower because of the Chinese economic rise. And Japanese friendship movement with China is getting worse because of some economical change of Japanese political society after the end of the Cold War. And the Chinese nationalism was getting stronger under the Jiang Zemin, the administration, because of patriotism movement and so on. However, Japanese government advanced policy to solve the history problem until 1995. It's so interesting. The public opinion and the policy was different. Okay? The positive rate was decreased. However, the Japanese government advanced the policy to solve the history problem. So in 1992, China enacted a territorial water law, including Senkaku Islands, but the Japanese government did not protest strongly. In the 1990s, in 1992, Japanese emperor visited China to express the remorse for aggression and the war. And in 1993, about the Konfutuman, Kono Yohei addressed his own statement, not his own, his government cabinet statement. And in 1984 and 5, PM Murayama announced 2 statements to express the remorse and apologize for Japanese aggression of the war and the colonial rule directly, so-called OABI, the apologize expression. However, from a Chinese point of view, it was so difficult to accept such Japanese approach to solve the history problem, because China recovered its authority, CCP, Chinese Communist Party, recovered its authority and rules after Tiananmen incident, and under the new situation, collapse of the socialist camp or the Soviet Union in the world. It's so difficult for China to accept Japanese approaches. After the latter part of the 1990s, the situation was drastically changed, especially in Japan, maybe China also. So-called the China threat was emerged, the so-called discourses of China threat was emerged in Japan. For example, military exercises around Taiwan in 1995 and 96, especially on March 1996. And the rapid economic growth of China. Okay, and so the Japan cannot control. Japan cannot adjust the history issues through the economy. it is difficult for Japan, and it becomes difficult for Japan. And the Chinese nationalism under the patriotism movement also stimulating toward the Japanese society. And Chinese visit also was stimulating toward Japanese society. And also in Japan, so-called alterations of generation. Because the most of the elder person like Nakasone and others experienced the war. So they have any atonement of consciousness towards Japan, about China, but the new generation, like Koizumi-san, they didn't have such a feeling or consciousness. So it's a big changes. And the decrease of the Chinese-Japanese friendship movement in Japan in 1990s, under the end of the Cold War, because the Socialist Party of the Japanese Socialist Party was the sponsor of the friendship movement, but the party was decreased in 1990s. So the situation was drastically changed. And in 1990s, it is so interesting. Japanese society has a more positive feeling toward Taiwan because of its economic development and democratization. In 1980s, Japanese people had a negative feeling toward Taiwan. It was a big change. So I explained the public opinion history issues, yes, between the 1970s, 1890s, but finally, I will mention one point. And the Murayama statement, at that time, China did not have any positive response to the Murayama statement. However, in 2007, when Jiabao visits Japan and he made a speech at the Japanese Congress, he says that he respects and he respects Japanese coping with history issues. And Jiabao said, Japan apologized for China again and again, many times. Yeah. So if you check these Japanese and the Chinese, these sentences, we understand the when Jiabao's statement so interesting for so-called reconciliation between Japan and China. However, after that, maybe both society of Japan and China forgot this statement. I think this even Jiabao's announcement is not important, but it is seemingly exceptional at present. So I finish my presentation. Thank you for your cordial attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Kawashima-sensei. I remember that visit very well. I was at the University of Tokyo studying with Takahara-sensei at that time, and it seems like a very long time ago in multiple senses of that phrase. So our first three speakers covered a remarkable amount of history in just 20 minutes. One clear takeaway is that 1972 was profoundly significant, not only because of the far more famous visit by President Nixon to China that February, but also because the normalization of Japan and China's diplomatic relations that September, an event that doesn't get much attention in the US, but it was still just hugely significant. And it occurred more than 6 years before the U.S. and PRC normalized their own relationship in 1979. So as we heard from our first three panelists, 1972 not only immediately transformed Japan's relations with both China and Taiwan, the legacies of which are still with us today, it also facilitated a remarkable expansion of bilateral economic exchanges that transformed China's political economy, and among other things, eventually led to China taking over the title of Japan's top trading partner from the United States in the early 2000s for the first time since World War II. But as Kawashima-sensei reminded us, as the emergence of the history and the issue in the 1980s also makes clear, diplomatic normalization was hardly a panacea for some very complicated challenges in this very important and complex relationship. I think many of these challenges have become all the more apparent in our current age, in the post-Cold War period, and especially in the 21st century, where security and other concerns increasingly define the relationship, even as the two countries remain top trading partners. So with that in mind, we now fast forward to the contemporary period, and our next three panelists will bring us up to speed on major issues in Japan-China relations today, as well as their implications for the United States. Leading us off is my old friend Yinan He from the Lehigh University, who will be speaking about China's approach and policies toward Japan, with a particular emphasis on developments since the Trump administration. And her remarks today are based in part on a wonderful paper she published earlier this year in Asia Policy, which we'll link to right now. Yinan, over to you.
Thank you. Good evening and good morning. It's my great pleasure to join distinguished colleagues from Japan and the U.S. to reflect on Sino-Japanese relations on the eve of the 50th anniversary of their diplomatic normalization. In 2009, I published a book titled The Search for Reconciliation, in which I studied the reasons for the lack of reconciliation in post-war Sino-Japanese relations. Since then, I have observed with more dismay the downward trend line in the relationship, despite some short periods of thaw or warm up, which would soon give way to next cycle of frost and tensions. So in this short presentation, I will briefly go over the main findings of the recent article that Adam just introduced that published in Asia Policy on the reasons for the most recent thaw in bilateral relations during the Trump years, and try to spell out implications for the current situation, as well as what other countries can learn from the case in formulating their policy to deal with an increasingly powerful and assertive China. During the Trump years, Japan seemed to have received an observable, what I call differential treatment from China compared to many other countries, which became victims of wolf warrior style diplomacy, usually featuring rhetorical bashing and non-military coercion. As the closest ally of the United States in the region and having intractable territorial and historical disputes with China, Japan would have been an obvious target of Chinese diplomatic intimidation, and yet, peculiarly, Japan was largely spared Beijing's anger. So this is not because Japan is conciliatory or silent on issues sensitive to China. In fact, Japan has pretty much stood its ground when it comes to things like Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, or East China Sea that are considered China's core interests. Two common views attribute China's relatively soft treatment of Japan to two reasons. One, Japan's clever diplomatic maneuvering, and two, China's hedging strategy in the shadow of a hostile Trump administration. Although both explanations are relative and useful, in my view, they need to be complemented by a third explanation, which is that Japan holds a uniquely advantageous bargaining position vis-a-vis Beijing because of its economic and technological strength, as well as its crucial role in the emerging security network in the Indo-Pacific. Japan's importance in China's regional ambitions was only magnified during the Trump era, when China battled the headwinds of both domestic and international challenges. Japan's bargaining leverage vis-a-vis China can be understood from both geoeconomic and geostrategic angles. For China, Japan is a crucial partner with which to stake out an alternative framework of regional integration when it is excluded from the TPP/CPTPP framework. Having been entangled in an ugly trade battle with the United States, China pinned much of its hope on the RCEP, which is Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. But to reach an early conclusion of RCEP, China needed support from Japan, which was a key member of RCEP, especially after India dropped out of the deal. China also very much needed to keep Japanese FDI, which would bring to China not only capital, but also jobs, tax revenues, and important technological spillover that China counted on to upgrade its industries and move up in the global value chains over the long term. Beijing was therefore compelled to trade lightly and avoid an open collision with Tokyo that would trigger an exodus of capital, especially during a time of severe economic difficulties. Other economic areas where China depended on Japanese cooperation include: one, its desire to increase investment in Japan, which has recently been placed under greater scrutiny for national security concerns. Two, currency swap arrangement that would help securitize its external transaction of money. Three, its infrastructure development ambition, an area that China still lacks experience and often can't go solo without collaboration with Japan. And four, China's plan of technological advancement in a wide range of areas such as telecommunication, healthcare, environmental protection, for which Japan is considered an indispensable partner. Japan not only has what China needs commercially and technologically, but also holds the key to a coordinated regional response to check China's strategic ambitions. In particular, Japan is the mastermind and linchpin of Quad, which is an Indo-Pacific initiative underpinned by shared core liberal values. Beijing is apprehensive about the anti-China undertone of the Quad and hopes to drive a wedge into the U.S.-Japan alliance on the one hand and their security partners on the other. Doing so would require China to stabilize its relationship with Japan. Another important benefit of staying on good terms with Japan is that it could help dissuade Japan from supporting Taiwan. China perceived that the best way to put a brake on Japan-Taiwan relations was to forge better ties with Japan itself. The Japan case shows that because of China's security and security anxieties under the shadow of the US-China strategic rivalry, countries that are probable targets of China's coercive diplomacy have a chance to improve their position if they can identify and acquire certain key leverage points vis-a-vis China, either on their own or through international coordination. Admittedly, most of China's neighbors are reluctant to take sides, especially explicitly between the US and China. But maintaining a balancing act need not stop them from leveraging strategic options to improve their position vis-a-vis China and tame its strategy to use force and influence as it pleases. Another implication is that China's relatively soft attitude to Japan was more of a short-term gesture than a genuine change of heart. When Japan became more vocal in protecting its territorial and security interests, China would quickly turn confrontational. The Chinese and Russian naval ships passing through the narrow Tsugaru Strait, separating Japan's main island and Hokkaido last year, and the landing of multiple missiles in Japanese EEZ in the recent Taiwan Strait crisis are just two examples of China's hawkish turn with short or no notice. It is therefore obvious that the thaw that I have been talking about is coming to an end, unfortunately, at a time when the two countries should be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the diplomatic normalization. This is what I have. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Inan. Next up, we have my co-moderator, Professor Akio Kakahara from the University of Tokyo, who will discuss contemporary China-Japan relations from a Japanese perspective. Akio, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Excuse me, thank you very much. Let me get this right if I can. I'm not sure if I can do this. Okay, so my task is to talk to you about Japan's policy towards China today. Not that I'm an expert on Japanese politics, so this is a very amateurish view, but I hope there'll be one or two points that you can learn something about. Now, many people believe that Japan and China are always quarreling or fighting. That's not the case. In recent years, you remember the very successful October 2018 official prime ministerial visit by Shinzo Abe to China. You see the photo on the very left here. Then, 3 years ago, Xi Jinping came to Japan, if you remember. He came to attend the G20 summit that was held in Osaka. He got a special treatment from Abe, who hosted a dinner especially for Xi Jinping. There were 19 other heads of state that came along, but she got some special treatment. And later that year, in 2019, Abe went to China again to attend the trilateral summit with Li Keqiang and Moon Jae-in, then president of South Korea. But before he had that, he did have a bilateral meeting with Xi Jinping. So things were going not too bad at that time. But since 2020, troubles arose again. We see the increase in the Chinese Coast Guard ships around the Senkakus. And since 2020, of course, COVID, that has had an impact all over the world, but also in Japan. People's impression of China got even worse. And the suppression of the protest movements in Hong Kong, this was big in Japan because a lot of the Japanese have lived in Hong Kong. Those who have lived in Hong Kong usually fall in love with the town. And we were all heartbroken when we saw what was going on in Hong Kong 2019, 2020. And the Uyghur issue there. And this year, one incident or one thing that had a big impact is, of course, the war in the Ukraine and China's tacit endorsement of the invasion. You know, on the second day of the invasion, Xi Jinping and Putin had a meeting over the phone. And according to the Russians, Xi Jinping stressed that he respected the actions adopted by the Russian leadership to deal with the crisis at hand. So it was a real endorsement of Putin's act. And then we saw Pelosi's visit, and the Pelosi's visit triggered a very large-scale drills unprecedented by the PLA around Taiwan. And as this has already been mentioned, there's been missiles landing in the vicinity of the Japanese islands, and the Japanese are very upset about all these developments. Okay, I have a very simple analytical framework to analyze Japan-China relations. This is a very simple chart. I look into 4 areas of factors that impact Japan-China relations. You know, there are hundreds of factors perhaps that impact Japan-China relations, but roughly speaking, we can categorize them into 4. Domestic politics of the 2 countries certainly have an impact on Japan-China relations. I'm going to talk a little more about the Japanese case, but second area is international environment and security. In East Asia, the largest international environmental factor is, of course, the United States. What America's policy towards East Asia is sort of impacts heavily on Japan-China relations. And since Japan has a security treaty with the United States, we can combine the security issues together in this category. And economic interests, no doubt. And finally, I think we should take people's perceptions, people's emotions and identity. What kind of a country should we be? How should we be looked at by other nations surrounding us? Those kinds of people's perception issues have an independent role in changing or influencing Japan-China relations. So using this, let's look at people's perceptions. This is another chart that of public surveys conducted in Japan, and both in Japan and China. And if you look at the red line, you can see the percentage of Japanese people who don't have a good image of China. It's as high as 91%. And the main reason why the Japanese don't have a good image of China is because the Chinese are sending their Coast Guard vessels into the territorial zones and into the contiguous zones around the Senkaku Islands. So if they're not going to stop this, I don't think they can change Japanese people's perception of China in a very big way. Okay, whatever else they do. And the green line is the percentage of the Chinese people who have a good image of Japan. And you see it got better and better after the big clash that we had over the Senkakus in 2012. The following year, the percentage was as low as 5%. But then it got better and better and better. But 2 years ago and last year, stagnated and fell. But this corresponds nicely with the increase in the Chinese visitors to Japan. And this year is 2019. So because of COVID in 2020, 2021, there were hardly anybody who came from China. And that kind of explains why the percentage of those who have a good image of Japan did not increase in the past two years. So personal exchange, we find is very important. On the economic front, China remains to be the largest trading partner of Japan, despite everything else. It's very huge. You can see that number 2 partner is the USA, number 3 partner is the EU. But if you put these together, And if you add Hong Kong onto the PRC, it's about the same. So you can see how big China is as our trading partner at this moment. So economic ties for Japan with China are very important. It's a very important factor in Japan-China relations. So we are facing a big challenge, that is, we must take a two-pronged approach, as it were. That means that we need to compete with China on the one hand, but we need to cooperate with it on the other. And this is the contradictory approach. It's not easy to accept psychologically. So we have to have the resilience, we have to have the wisdom to live with the contradiction. But it's increasingly difficult to strike a balance because competition will intensify and cooperation will deepen on the other hand. So our nations will be divided, as we see in our countries today. So we need to use a lot of time and energy on internal coordination and persuasion. So what about Prime Minister Kishida? Is he meeting this challenge well? Well, he is surrounded with all these factors, like his, people's emotions, perceptions of China are not very good at all. The security factor is very tight. International environment, U.S.-China relations are very tense at the moment. And in terms of domestic politics, his power base is not solid enough, as it were, to be persuasive to both sides, the hardliners and the those who more advocate for a softer approach towards China. Prime Minister Abe was able to embrace both sides, as it were. He was tough on the one hand, but also he tried to promote cooperation with China on the other, and was very successful because his power base was very solid and wide. Economics should be a stabilizing factor, but it's not as powerful as before. I think I've run out of time or gone over the time, so I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Akio. All right, so last and least, we have myself. So let me just share screen. So my colleagues have given me 5 extremely tough acts to follow, but with my limited time, I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking about the extremely complicated issue of One China that Rob referred to in his remarks. I had originally planned to make a very different presentation at tonight's event that would focus on my new article in the China Quarterly on Japan-Taiwan relations. But having witnessed a tremendous amount of misinformation and frankly disinformation in recent weeks about both the U.S. and Japan's One China policies, I decided to focus my remarks on a more general overview of the contested meaning of One China internationally. Of course, be happy to take any Japan-specific questions during the Q&A. So basically speaking, though the People's Republic of China has never actually governed Taiwan, Beijing's position is that Taiwan is part of the PRC. Beijing has repeatedly stated that it aims to achieve what it calls peaceful reunification, but also does not forswear the use of force if what it considers pro-independence actors in Taiwan move towards its perceived red line, generally assumed to mean a declaration of de jure independence. And in recent years, we see increasingly active efforts by Beijing to shape the global discourse on One China, including assertions that Beijing's so-called One China principle is a universal consensus and a widely recognized norm of international relations. Yet whether this kind of framing is appropriate really depends on your perspective. What One China means, both in principle and in practice, is far more contested not only across the Taiwan Strait, but also internationally than Beijing would care to admit. This includes not only the famously ambiguous U.S. position on Taiwan's status, but also that of Japan since 1972. So with the limited time I have left today, about 5 minutes, I'd like to briefly make 5 main points. The first point is perhaps the most obvious one, certainly to this audience. Simply put, since 1949, the governments in Beijing and Taipei have basically not agreed on what One China means. Since its establishment in 1949, the PRC has never governed, administered, or controlled the territories marked in orange. Beijing regards Taiwan as a breakaway province, which it has vowed to retake by force if necessary. But Taiwan's leaders say Taiwan is a sovereign state known as the Republic of China, has its own constitution, democratically elected leaders, and its own military. And especially since its democratization in the 1990s, there's far more political contestation within Taiwan itself about both Taiwan's status and its relationship with China. Here we see that in recent years, the percentage of people in Taiwan who think that Taiwan is already an independent country, named the Republic of China, represent the overwhelming majority. We can also see that the percentage of people in Taiwan who identify as exclusively Chinese has plummeted to low single digits, while those who identify exclusively as Taiwanese are now the majority. Now, whether this tells us anything about sovereignty-related questions or views on that issue, as opposed to just cultural identity, is certainly up for debate. But what I want to emphasize here is the change and the long-term trend line. My second point is that the number of foreign governments who recognize the PRC as the legal government of China has varied widely after 1949. Even today, not all foreign governments recognize the PRC as the legal government of China, but those which continue to have official diplomatic relations with the ROC, or Taiwan, are now very few. As has been made clear by my colleagues already, the major turning point in the PRC's international recognition was the early 1970s. For its part, Japan switched recognition to Beijing in 1972, 50 years ago this week, just a few months after Nixon made his historic trip to China. There's been a gradual decline in the number of countries recognizing the ROC, or Taiwan, over the past 50 years. In fact, today, just 14 foreign governments do not recognize Beijing and instead recognize the ROC. Most of these are very small countries, and importantly, since South Korea switched recognition in 1992, no governments in East Asia have official diplomatic relations with Taiwan. But my third point is that, as I mentioned a moment ago, the PRC's increasingly proactively promotes a misleading narrative today that the U.S., Japan, and others accept its definition of its One China principle. The goal is to imply or assert that there's a universal consensus on Taiwan's status, but that's just not true. Unfortunately, many media, even well-intentioned, extremely well-resourced, and nonpartisan ones, repeatedly get it wrong. Despite what 60 Minutes narrator said in last week's broadcast, it is not true that, quote, U.S. policy since 1979 has been to recognize Taiwan as part of China. Note the careful wording of these normalization communiques between the PRC and its three top national trading partners, Japan, the United States, and South Korea. Though all three of these governments recognize the PRC as the legal government of China, they have never formally recognized Beijing's claim that Taiwan is part of the PRC. Rather, they only acknowledge or express understanding and respect for Beijing's position. That's different than accepting or agreeing with Beijing's position. Importantly, though, none of these governments will openly challenge, in most cases, Beijing's claim, at least not with their official positions. This effectively cedes the rhetorical narrative to Beijing. And regardless of their official positions, I want to emphasize a fourth point that's often overlooked: how key major powers like Japan and the United States choose to operationalize their effective One China policies, especially as it concerns the extent and nature of their engagement with and support for Taiwan, can vary widely. For example, as I argue in a recent article, even though South Korea, Japan, and the United States basically have a similar so-called do not recognize, do not challenge position on the PRC's claim of sovereignty over Taiwan, the extent to which they openly express rhetorical support for Taiwan, openly oppose Beijing's threats against it, and engage in practical cooperation with Taipei varies widely across these cases. The US is far and away the most forward-leaning, but in recent months and years, many US allies in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe, including Japan, of course, have begun to be far more vocal about support for Taiwan and expressing concerns about peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And now I'd like to make my fifth and final point. As I just noted, we can see from the historical record that since the 1970s, both beyond and distinct from many foreign governments' abstract official positions on Taiwan's status, there's a separate question of how that government chooses to actually formulate and carry out its concrete policies towards Taiwan. And in key cases, including the U.S. and Japan again, we can see that the nature and extent of engagement with and support for Taiwan can vary over time, not just across cases, but even within a single country case. And even if that government's official decades-old position on Taiwan's status does not ever change. With the U.S., in just the past couple of years, we can see, just as an example, a gradual change in the rules that define which government officials can interact with their Taiwanese counterparts and how. We can also see an example in the frequency and nature of the defensive weapon systems that the U.S. sells to Taiwan to bolster cross-strait deterrence, such as this sale announced just 3 weeks ago. And we can also see more forward-leaning legislation advancing in the U.S. Congress, though it's not clear what will happen with this particular one. The Taiwan Policy Act currently under consideration could be the most ambitious U.S. legislation concerning Taiwan in many years, and it includes a call for Taiwan to, quote, be treated as though it were designated a major non-NATO ally, end quote. Even in the Japanese case, we also see subtle changes to the nature and extent of Tokyo's nominally unofficial engagement with Taiwanese counterparts, as well as a greater willingness of Japanese leaders to speak up in support of Taiwan's international space, and even to more regularly link cross-strait stability to Japan's own national security interest. It's important to note, however, that in fundamental ways, Japan's official positions have not changed. For example, despite a lot of hype over the past 2 years or so, Japan's government does not make any security commitments to Taiwan, nor do the two engage in bilateral security cooperation. But nevertheless, concerns in Japan about peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait and skepticism about China's intentions are increasingly prominent and mainstream. These two trends are coalescing in increasingly robust efforts by Tokyo and Washington separately and in coordination to support Taiwan, be it through joining multilateral fora for dialogue, such as the Global Cooperation and Training Framework, coordinating massive donations of COVID vaccines, or efforts to bolster deterrence across the Taiwan Strait. So to wrap up, 50 years after both Nixon and Tanaka went to China, what one China is and what it means for Taiwan and foreign states' policies toward Taiwan remains heavily contested, not just across the Taiwan Strait, but also internationally. And this includes Japan. Beyond the question of Taiwan's status, the practical implications of major policies, actual one China policies, right, matter too. And though the US gets most of the attention, as I argue in my article just published yesterday, Japan is a critically important player as well and deserves all attention as well, as do other US allies. Now, I think I'm probably on the verge of, if not more likely, already violating my own imposed time limit at this point. So I think I'll end there and turn things over to Professor Takahara to moderate an intra-panel discussion for about the next 10 minutes or so. And then we'll open things up to the audience for Q&A, and the chat is now unlocked. So Takahara Sensei, over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Adam. I think they were all wonderful presentations, and I'm going to ask, I have tons of questions, but perhaps limit one question to each of the speakers, except me, if I may. First to Hoppen Sensei, thank you so much for the detailed interpretation of the negotiations in 1972. You know, some people criticize the negotiations these days because they say the negotiations were flawed. They have left a lot of questions that disrupt Japan-China relations today. What's your view about that? That's the question to you. Let me just present all the questions first. To Lotard Sensei, yes, a lot of contributions to China's economic development after normalization of relations, but what are the legacies of that contribution? Do you see any impact it had on the later relationship between Japan and China? To Kawashima Sensei, is it fair to say that the Chinese had been utilizing the history card, as it were? You know, and if they were using the history card, has that been effective? What's your view? To Inan, to her Sensei, interesting that your view that the Chinese were soft towards Japan, but from the Japanese point of view, you know, it looks very odd, since on the one hand, they keep on sending their Coast Guard vessels so often, and very provocative from the Japanese point of view. Were they still serious about mending relations with Japan when they send these boats and say a lot of things at the same time, you know, criticisms against Japan? And to Adam, if I may, what's the purpose of operationalizing one China policy on the US side? What is the United States really aiming at? What are they trying to achieve through these changes in the US-China Taiwan policy? Okay, so if I can give you 1 minute each to answer the questions, I'll be most happy to hear them. Can I start from Hoppen Sensei, please?
Thank you very much, Professor Takahara. Yeah, there's no doubt that the agreements that the Japanese and the Chinese came to in 1972 left a lot of issues unresolved. Most obviously, the Senkaku or Diaoyu issue, which, wasn't dealt with at all, actually. But I mean, I think part of the historical interpretation has to go back and look at what the two sides were interested in 1972. That for the Chinese side, in addition to Taiwan, the Chinese side were much more interested in sort of the international geopolitical situation, and especially their anti-Soviet strategy, the idea that just like the United States was interested in improving relations with the PRC, so the PRC was interested in improving relations with the United States and Japan, largely as a result of this international geostrategic overview. And for this, they were willing to compromise on certain issues, including the Taiwan issue, the fact that the Chinese did not drive a harder bargain in getting the Americans or the Japanese to formally recognize the one China policy rather than simply acknowledge it or understand it. On the Japanese side, there are issues like this as well, that it's hard to see how the Japanese could have driven a much harder bargain on the Senkaku Islands issue. They could have, perhaps, but it's doubtful that the Chinese would have compromised much on this issue. So partly the answer to this question is you have to look at it in sort of the historical context, that the concerns we have today and the dissatisfactions that people have on both sides with the agreements that were made in 1972 were not the main or overriding issues that people were concerned with 50 years ago.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Yes, I also think it's impossible to solve everything at one go. So it would be too harsh if somebody criticized Tanaka or Zhou Enlai for what they had to leave over to the next generation. So it's on our part, we have to make efforts to make up for whatever was not solved at that time. That I share that view too. Thank you very much. Next, can I move to Lutad Sensei?
Thank you very much, Professor Takahara, for your question and comments. I think out of all of the different effects that I talked about tonight, perhaps the most lasting legacy is the influence of industrial policy in China. Even the Japanese terms for and concepts for industrial policy and industrial structure, these were introduced by Chinese economists into policy debates and quickly became core concepts that guided decades of China's economic thinking afterward. But of course, the effects were not so straightforward, even in this area, where I argue that there was perhaps the greatest influence because of the domestic debate within China about which aspects of Japan's experience could be adapted and applied in the Chinese context. So just to give a specific example related to the industrial policy, the State Planning Commission, for example, advocated for multi-year sectoral planning. They wanted to focus on pillar and strategic industries. The State Economic Commission in China, for example, wanted to establish enterprise groups, a different form of corporate structure, business associations. I won't keep speaking of others, but different actors. There's a lot of internal debate linked to China's domestic politics about how to apply these ideas from Japan to China. In terms of the obstacles to the long-term legacy as well, even things like quality control, which were so influential in China, didn't always have the long-term legacy effects because of the incentives in China for production volume over quality, for example. Other aspects of Japan's experience, privatization, for example, very important in Japan, private companies, but never really going to play that same role in China. So there are certain limits as well, I think, to the applicability and therefore the long-term legacy. And just to briefly conclude, in terms of the foreign technology, which was the other effect that I talked about, that of course became as well more limited for China over time. China itself had less need to import foreign technology from Japan or other countries. And finally, looking at Japan's domestic situation in later years, Japan's economic downturn made it somewhat less attractive as an example for China and its economic policymaking. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very illuminating. If I may add one small question, have those contributions in those days, been factors that sustain Japan-China relations today? what was the impact on the bilateral relationship?
Well, I realize as I see the figure of public opinion in China toward Japan that the period I'm studying is certainly, we could call it a honeymoon period. So several years ago, NHK in Japan did a wonderful documentary looking at the types of exchanges that I study. And I think there was broad recognition in China. I think sometimes it can be difficult to acknowledge the influence of other countries and what is often perceived as a domestic success story, but certainly the lasting legacy, I think, is there, even if it may be for a variety of reasons difficult to acknowledge fully.
Thank you so much. Okay, let's move on to Kawashima Sensei, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Very interesting question. Yes, yeah, China utilizes history cards. Is it efficient or not? That's interesting. I also want to point that in 1980s, so-called history problem was had this combination between Japan and China. In Japan, there was a history problem between a conservative group and a not conservative or liberal or non-conservative group. So Chinese historical card was combined, I think it was sympathetic with the Japanese non-conservative group. So some Japanese group, has sympathy with China. So they made strong pressure to the Japanese government or conservative group. So that was a little bit efficient with some extent. However, in 1990s, the situation was changed. So for example, Japanese Socialist Party was decreased so much. And as I said, so-called Sino-Japanese friendship movement also was decreased. So in Japanese society, so-called history issue, the structural history issue was changed so strongly. So it was difficult for China to use a history card. However, maybe China did not find this point. So China continued using history card, where the card was stimulating towards Japanese society. So Japanese public opinion was getting worse and worse. So this is my answer. So in the 1980s, it was maybe efficient, but after 1990s, it was not efficient. This is my answer.
It's fascinating. Thank you very much. Yes, after the end of the Cold War in Japanese politics also changed. The structure, disappeared, and the Chinese didn't realize that difference until recently, perhaps. Yes, thank you so much for that. Professor He, please.
Thank you, Takahara Sensei, for your question. And you asked whether China was truly soft to Japan during the Trump administration. And I agree with you that it wasn't really soft. It's only first of all, in relative term, comparing China's treatment of Japan with its treatment of other countries like Australia or Canada, who's got, all these hostage diplomacy issues. And maybe some European countries who were also bashed by China's wolf warriors. So in relative terms, and also it's softer in the rhetorical term more than the substantive terms. So yes, China's belief that it's been soft, being lenient to Japan, to Japan in terms of the way they deal with them rhetorically, but they wouldn't make any real concessions on issues that are important to Japan, such as the Senkaku Diaoyu intrusion issue, or some South China Sea issues, which Japan also care about, and Taiwan issue. And the reason that China didn't think they need to make real concessions to Japan, even when they were trying to improve the relationship, was that the way I read the Chinese the political analysis writings on this issue is that they don't think they have to. They felt that they have enough leverage vis-a-vis Japan, because Japan depended so much on Chinese market, that they believe that Japan's economic future is really contingent on the relationship with China. So they felt that there's so much that Japan needed from China that they were already being nice enough to Japan. And Japan should recognize that the rise of China is irresistible, and you better accepted the rise of China, accepted the reality, rather than try to change its fate. And this is what I addressed in the article, that these are the fundamental reasons that explains why the Chinese side have very little incentive to make real concessions to Japan. And as I agree with you that no real concessions were made, no substantial measures of policy in order to really make real improvements during Trump administration. And then when the strategic environment turned more confrontational during the pandemic, and since then, it's very obvious that China quickly stopped its rhetorical courting of Japan and turned to confrontational again.
Great, thank you very much. I think there are questions directly addressed to us, and Adam, you don't have to answer my question. Please give priority to the students in answering whatever questions that you have received on your side.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much, Takahata-sensei. We do only have 12 minutes left, so I appreciate that we want to prioritize student questions from the audience. I do see a couple student questions, but there's a lot of text on the screen and it's difficult to parse. I think the first question is for you, Professor Takahata, from a student at Todai from China. And the question goes as follows. Following the United States, Japan restricts high-tech exports to China. How does Japan consider the damage to trade? What does Japan think about the risks of this, I think is what the question is asking. Does the Japanese government expect it can find alternative buyers in the short term? What do you think?
It's certainly giving big headaches to a lot of the Japanese companies who have businesses with China. And they are trying to come up with measures to deal with this new situation. You know, they don't like these sanctions, of course, from the business's point of view. And I think one measure that they are discussing or gradually implementing now is to separate their business activities, you know, within their country. One side does business with the United States and Europe, perhaps, and the other side focuses on China, and try to devise a way that, you know, the company that does businesses with China, you know, maybe they are subject to sanctions, but the other part of the company does not get subject to the sanctions. That kind of an approach, I think, is now being devised, but people are having huge headaches about this and are in the process of coming up with countermeasures. That's my understanding.
All right, thank you very much. We have another question from a student from Indiana University, a PhD student in political science. And I think I will direct this question to Professor Kawashima and Takahara and Wendy. Professor Leutert, if you'd like to get in on this, please, by all means. The question is about economic aid that's been provided from Japan to China over the years. And the question is, what were the forms of these aids? Were they loans, investment, or charity? How has that changed over time? And also, what were the intentions on the part of the Japanese government in offering this aid? Professor Kawashima, can I ask you to respond first, please?
Yes. The so-called Japanese ODA was studied in 1979 when Ohira visited China. And the formal purpose is just support Chinese reforming policy. This is economic aid to expect Chinese economic development. However, Nakasone also and other politicians said almost at their memoir, this Japanese ODA, for their point of view, this is the Japanese so-called a liberation, or there's some atonement consciousness. So formally, it is not the liberation. However, the politicians' point of view, this meant the liberation. This is the diplomatic point of view, just of supporting aid towards the economic development. Secondly, that was studied in the 1980s. However, at the Koizumi period, that was revised because the other time in Japanese public opinion was against such support, Japanese ODA, because Japan supported China and China uses this support ODA to enhance its military ability, capacity, and so on. So Japan changed the contents to some environmental, some projects and other projects in the inner China. So at the Koizumi period changed it, and also in 2006 and 2007, Japan stopped the loans, stopped loans, and also in 2018, Japan stopped the technical aid. So therefore, some larger projects on the so-called infrastructures, and also in Koizumi period changed the much more small, some environmental or solve the gap between the coastal and the inner China. And in 2006 and 2007, stopped the loans. And also in 2018, at the Abe period, Japan stopped the technical aid. This is my answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Takahara Sensei, would you like to respond, or should we go to the next question?
Generally speaking, Japan's ODA, the large chunk of it is the yen loans, but the interest rate's very low, the grace period is very long, and therefore the so-called grant element is usually very high, close to 70% or something like that. But the Japanese think it's better to provide loan in that way rather than just to provide grants to the developing nations. And the Japanese think this method has been rather successful. And this was the measure that was taken to China. Thanks. That's all from me.
Thank you. Next question. We have lots of questions from students, which makes me very, very happy. Thank you for thank you for participating, students, and thank you for sending in your questions. So the next question is for Professor Leutert, and it comes from a PhD candidate at the University of Tokyo. I'll just read it out loud if that's okay. As you mentioned at the bottom of page 224 in your book chapter, China was engaging with multiple foreign countries where Japan was seen as a non-Western country. Could you kindly elaborate on what you mean by this? How was Japan positioned among other cooperating countries in China?
Thank you very much for this question. I hope that I'll have the opportunity to meet you in person in the spring. So during China's reform period, they turned to a number of different countries with regard to different policy issues and areas, and who they looked to and engaged with varied over time. And so the period of engagement that I'm focusing on and the influence of Japan was really strongest during that very early reform period, because China felt that there were important similarities between the situation that it was facing coming out of the Cultural Revolution, the decade-long period of domestic turmoil that China had gone through, and the very rapid period of post-war development that China had experienced. Of course, China also very interested in West Germany as well, and so we can see their interest in these types of economies. They were able to catch up quite rapidly economically, being the primary focus. But later they shift away from Japan, and there's a lot more focus and engagement with other models and other actors, including some advanced capitalist countries like the United States, as well as Singapore, other countries in the region. And so there's a very strong focus on Japan during this early reform period that then becomes more broad over time. And I also want to say that these types of very formal exchanges, like the study tours that I talked about, the need for the highly formal mechanisms of bilateral engagement gradually faded away as more informal forms of bilateral engagement became better institutionalized over time.
All right, thank you, Wendy. Let's see. Okay, so I think I'd like to direct this next question to Rob and Inan. And it's really about kind of U.S. perspectives on the Japan-China relationship. And I think from your areas of expertise, based on the time period you're most comfortable talking about, could you please share with us your sense of how the United States view and perspective on the vicissitudes in the Japan-China relationship has changed over time? And if you can, if you have any thoughts on how the U.S. views the relationship today, that would be great. Rob, perhaps start with you from a historical perspective.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. I mentioned in my brief remarks, I mentioned this issue of the Japan model of normalization, and there was considerable discontent, I think, on the part of people like Kissinger and Nixon that the Japanese had sort of gone too far in the 1970s, sort of gotten ahead of the United States, and there were some complaints about this in the 1970s. Building on some of what Professor Kawashima brought up in his remarks about the Tiananmen incident as well, there was considerable criticism within the United States of the Japanese sort of not going along enough with sanctions and lifting sanctions on the PRC too early, although within the George H.W. Bush administration, there was actually the opposite sort of reaction that this gave them cover to sort of improve relations with China. And of course, today, as you can see with the outpouring of, respect and sort of remembrances of Prime Minister Abe, I think, there's a lot of appreciation in the United States for the position that Japan has taken in recent years in strengthening the U.S.-Japan alliance and cooperating with the United States in sort of a dual approach to China. So it's changed quite a bit, I think, over the past 50 years, but maybe on contemporary issues, I can leave it to Professor He to elaborate.
Okay, that's a good question. I haven't given that too much thought systematically, but now, as I think about it, there are at least two things involved here in terms of the U.S., China, Japan triangular relationship. To give a historical perspective on this, ever since the end of World War II, U.S. occupation of Japan, and there has been a perennial problem, actually point of tension between U.S. and Japan, which is rearmament of Japan, and also U.S. pressure, the Gaiats forcing Japan or compelling Japan to contribute to the alliance, and also to make a contribution when there's a regional contingency regarding Taiwan or regarding Korea, or elsewhere. And the Japan under the Yoshida Doctrine has been for a long time resisted the pressure from the U.S. to rearm and also to make contribution. But I think after a long transition period from Koizumi, at least going back to Koizumi, or if not earlier, to the Ozawa, the controversy started up by Ozawa after the Gulf War, that Japan has gradually come to the point where they have realized that there's enough strategic pressure that can justify increase of defense spending, and also more active participation in the alliance actions when there are regional contingencies. Professor Takahara and Kawashima can correct me on this, but recently I heard another scholar expert on the Japanese military spending giving us a lot of data about the greater public support to increase of defense spending, and that's something that's been having a great change ever since the end of end of World War II. That's something the United States has always wanted to see, but it took them a long time to come along to have a position that is close to the U.S. position. And the second, more on the triangular relationship, my point is that at least since the normalization, there has been this delicate triangular relationship where they say that when U.S.-China relationship are not going well, then the relationship between China and Japan tend to improve. Oftentimes because China would like to take advantage of whatever tension or friction between U.S. and Japan in order to court Japan and avoid being isolated in the triangular relationship. But this kind of a strategy or this kind of a scenario has become less prominent or less a successful model for China to play in at least since the I would say Biden administration, because Biden has made quite a bit of success in terms of building up a coalition, or what I maybe call it the United Front vis-a-vis China, and which made it harder for Japan, made it harder for China to play the wedge strategy and to maybe woo Japan in order to play against, as a counterweight against the United States. And that kind of a model has faded, at least in the recent years, in my view.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry, folks, but we've run out of time. To those audience members who did not get your questions answered, I'm so sorry, but I hope we can hold another event on this topic. As I mentioned at the outset, does not get nearly as much attention as it deserves, not just in the United States, but elsewhere as well. And so I think the China-Japan relationship is just hugely important to the United States and of course to Japan and China and the rest of the region and the world. So this was really a fantastic panel. I'd like to start by thanking our panelists for sharing your research and expertise with me, with the other panelists, and with the audience. I'd also like to offer a special thank you to my co-moderator, Professor Takahara, and also to the University of Tokyo's Graduate School of Public Policy for their willingness to co-sponsor and collaborate. You know, I first walked into Professor Takahara's classroom about 16 years ago, and he's been an invaluable mentor and friend ever since. And it's a particular personal and professional thrill to be able to co-moderate something with you. I hope this collaboration is not our last. Thank you to the audience, and many thanks again to our panelists, to the Japan Foundation. And with that, Professor Takahara, would you like to add anything before we say goodnight? Or good morning?
Nothing to add. I just want to echo what you just said, Adam. Thank you very much indeed to everybody.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Good night, good afternoon, good morning. Have a wonderful day, wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care and hope to see you at an event again. Thanks, everybody.